Thank you all for joining us. This is our third week, so we're halfway through our community networks trainings leading up to our 2020 Indigenous Connectivity Summit. First of all, I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. Second of all, I'm going to plug our Indigenous Connectivity Summit. If you're signed up for this training, but not the summit, I'm just going to drop a link in the chat where you can find a bunch of information about the summit. And you can register there and you can continue to have these conversations that we're having in these trainings with many of the same people and some different people as well. A few housekeeping items is please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking because we do record these, so we just want to make sure that our audio from our speakers is crystal clear. If you have a question, please bring it up in the chat. You can type it in the chat or you can mention that you have a hand. There's a raise hand function on Zoom. We have a few people monitoring the chat and all the Zoom features and functions. So we're gonna get to your hand and we'll definitely address your question. Like I said, we're recording all the sessions, so you'll be able to watch this back later, send it to a friend. And also if for any reason you cannot attend one of the sessions live, you can always just email us later and let us know that you watched it. For the reason that we do pay attention to who's on these calls, we'll issue certificates at the end of this training for everyone who has attended all of the sessions. I'm also going to plug into the chat a link to our speakers and sessions along with the password. So you can find all of that there. And a few more housekeeping items before we move on. First is sometimes there are really difficult to understand terms or acronyms that for people who work in this space just kind of come like second nature, but to others, they're not second nature. So if there's something that you don't understand, a word that's used or a phrase or an acronym, just say so in the chat and we'll address it and we'll answer that question. It's really important that we, make that information accessible to everyone. And then last week we talked about creating a Slack for you all to connect with one another. That's something that we're currently working on with our IT department, so more to come. And then finally, we're going to be sending out a feedback survey soon. We'd love to hear about what you all like about these sessions, what you think could be improved, and more. So please give us the feedback that you think is helpful. We just want to make these the most engaging and helpful to you all as they can possibly be. All right, so I think that is all from me for today. We have an awesome lineup of trainers today. They are truly all-stars. We have Melanie Pilon, Rob McMahon, and Penny Carpenter. I believe that the agenda that they have in order is that Melanie is going to present, then Rob is going to present, and then I'm going to do a little interview Q&A with Penny, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone. And then Matt Rantanen, who is someone who's really involved with the ICS community. He is currently in the woods on a hunting trip for much of September, which is fantastic. That sounds great to go off the grid right now. But he has a video pre-recorded, and if there's time, we'll play it. But if not, then we're just going to put it on the website so you all can watch it later. So I am going to turn it over to you, Melanie, to kick us off.
Perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Pilon. I'm the Economic Development Officer here at the Township of Dubreuil. I'm also the project lead for the Northeast Superior Regional Broadband Network. And I will preface this conversation with, I'm not a technology person. My background is in business administration. But I will share our story of the NSRBN. We're a group now, sorry Sally, of only 8 communities, 4 First Nations and 4 municipalities. But we do have an interesting story and of creating our own regional ISP and connecting a large chunk of Northern Ontario. So I have a PowerPoint to share, and Sarah will hopefully help me with that. And certainly let me know if you have any questions. So this is, these are the kind of points that I'm going to touch upon. So we'll go through just our background, who's involved, our project timeline, and then our lessons learned. So just a project overview. So Sarah, if you want to jump right to, I guess, yeah, there we go. Oh, did you want to maybe slide 3? So this is a map of so I'll just tell you a little bit about our background. So the Township of Dubreuilville's Economic Development Corporation initiated the project in 2017. We had originally planned to apply to Connect to Innovate Fund. It was a federal fund put out. It became very clear that one community wasn't able to do it without technical expertise. So I couldn't do it on my own. And it was also clear that we needed to broaden the scope. We wouldn't be able to, one community was very unlikely to be approved. The business case for one rural community is non-existent. In my community, we have 600 people who live in it. We have 300 households. So to have a Bell or a large ISP come in is very unlikely. So we recognized that if we got all kinds of communities together, our chances of success would be better. So Sarah, if we go to the next slide, we can show who's involved. So we originally had 10 communities, 5 First Nations and 5 municipalities. That's recently went down to 4 and 4. This map doesn't do a lot of justice. This area actually covers an area similar to the size of Prince Edward Island. And for those who aren't familiar with the geography of Northern Ontario, we're located somewhere in between Winnipeg and Toronto. So we're pretty secluded, and our terrain is very rocky and we're not flat. We're very rural. So those are our communities, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'm Dubreuilville right in the middle, kind of on an island. So all of our communities had various levels of connectivity. So can we go to the next slide, Sarah? So we did, early on, we chunked up our project into 4 different phases. So phase 1, we started off with doing a desktop and detailed analysis. So basically what that was is we wanted to, we hired a brilliant project manager, and we wanted to really just figure out what we had in the region, what kind of infrastructure we had in the region, and what we wanted, and how much was it going to cost us. Just very, very high level budget numbers. Our phase 2, we needed to secure a vendor partner. We knew we couldn't do this on our own. And so we wanted to get a partner in the industry. And this was actually a requirement of a federal fund. The CRTC required that we get a vendor partner as well. Phase 3 was to secure funding. So we needed money. We needed lots of money. So we're still securing funding, and we had been through right from the start. And phase 4 was project implementation, so actually putting shovels in the ground. And because we have 8 different communities, our project implementation will be staggered. So our first fiber build is going to be is scheduled for 2021. So our next slide is actually just a cut and paste out of what was in our original scope of work for our desktop and detailed analysis. So I won't read every one, but basically what we were looking for, we were looking to prepare a consolidated report detailing the current status of connectivity in each one of our communities. Like I said, some communities had really good connectivity. Some, like the community I'm in, Duberville, we were on an island. We had terrible connectivity. So much so that our current system is at capacity. If you were to move to Duberville today, you cannot even, Bell Canada will not even connect you. Our system is at capacity. You have to get satellite. That's your only option in our town. So every one of our communities was different. So we wanted to find out what the current status was in all of our communities. We wanted to identify infrastructure gaps, complete a risk matrix, and then of course, get a listing of recommendations. So that report turned out to be the foundation of, it was our handbook. We used it to create every single one of our funding applications. So it was a very good investment. This slide is a snapshot of our gap analysis. So the red circles are bad. That was the gap that was identified. The blue indicates where there was an availability. So where you can see that there's lots of red. So in Duberville, which was the island in the middle, was you can see where we had quite a bit of, our connectivity was very, very bad. We had a very, very large gap. Other communities didn't have any connectivity. Missinabie First Nations, right to the right of Duberville, was one of those communities. So our First Nations communities had quite a bit of gaps compared to the very one of our communities, Chapleau. They were very, very well connected, and that was one of the communities that left the NSRBN because they were very well connected. So. Amadeo, he's our project manager. He actually went out into the field and did what he calls ground truthing. It's a very fancy term for him driving around and actually doing a visual inspection of the infrastructure we had in our communities. So he actually went out, took pictures of what we had and identified things. That was a very, very worthwhile exercise because he did identify a lot of infrastructure that we had in the communities that we didn't know was there. So there was a lot of dark fiber in the communities that had been installed by Bell Canada or previous ISPs that we didn't know was there. Now we know. So it was very, very worthwhile to go out and actually get on the ground and get some field work done. Phase 2 was to secure the vendor partner. So we created an expression of interest. We posted it on Mercs. We formed a review team. And we had very, very good interest. And like I said, that was a requirement of the CRTC funding application. So, next slide. Some of the expression of interest considerations, they really came from the NSRBN group. So certainly the timing of the provincial and federal funding that was coming down, developing a preferred vendor partner profile. So somebody that would be able to service all 10 of our communities. Some of the companies were only interested in working with half of our region and not the other half. We were interested in a company that had experience working with First Nations communities, and that would include training and employment agreements, and that had experience in other telecom services like cell phones or telephone services, things like that. Revenue sharing agreements. So those were all things that we included in our expression of interest. So phase number 3 was securing funding. So right from the very, very start of this 3 years ago, the NSRBN has been extremely aggressive in applying for funding. So here's a list of all the funding applications that we have applied for. And it seems like we're always doing a funding application. All of the funding applications, at least in Canada, they really promote collaboration. It seems that one community going out on its own has very little chance of getting approved. So the collaborative approach is really key. We were also very cognizant of the fact that the First Nations municipal partnership was also very key. Dubreuilville is a French minority community, official language community. So we believe that that has helped us as well. And project implementation. So taking the project through its life cycle is our goal. Like I said, we have our first fiber build scheduled to be started in 2021. So Sarah, should I stop and start answering some questions? Do a midway break?
Sure, yeah, I think that sounds great.
I feel like I'm just rambling on and I'm seeing them all build up here.
Yeah, there are a lot of specific questions about your project in the chat. So the first one is from Bernie. Bernie, do you want to ask it out loud or just let the chat speak for itself?
All right, where's that mute button? There we go. Hi, so, oh yes, well, the first one was with regards to speed. So in the one of the slides, you have the blue and the red. I'm just curious, what was red and what was blue? Like, what were the upload and download speeds that were identified as blue and red?
So because I have my project manager on this chat, I could try and mumble through this, but because Amadeo is on this call, I'm going to defer that to him.
I'm so glad I combed my hair today. Thanks, Melanie. Bernie, and hi everyone. It wasn't so much that it was a matrix that at the time the provincial government had forwarded to me that they used, and it's based on the amount of bandwidth per segment. So there was household, business, hospital, clinic, school, and we applied basically, 100 meg, 100 meg, 10 meg, 25 meg, and added up that capacity, what it should be if everybody was using the internet at the same time, came up with a number. And then I came out of the industry, out of a bunch of telecom companies, and I also polled a bunch of network engineers and came up with a oversubscription rate. Some companies use 20 to 1. We went a little better. We thought 4 to 1, especially accounting for the growing broadband, and came up with basically what the community should have at a certain time, and compared it to what I could deduce from the ground truthing and my interviews with the carriers as to what they had in market, so that they have an old Nortel DMS 10 and some old ADSL. Like Melanie said, Dubreuilville was out of capacity. And it is an estimation. It's to paint a picture to show the level of the gap, because we realized that, talking to government, talking to providers, it was valuable to have a picture and to actually identify what we think the problem is. So it was that, basically just using some network capacity math from days gone by. Hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Kathy, you also had a question.
Sure. My question is, you mentioned a handbook that you had created and that you used it all the time. And I was just wondering, how much did it cost in the first place to create that? Because I assume you didn't have funding to create that. And how long did it take you? I don't know if you're allowed to answer that.
Yes, so I can answer that. We absolutely had funding. We acquired RED funding, so that's Rural Economic Development funding from the provincial government. So the province of Ontario funded it. It cost in the neighborhood of, correct me if I'm wrong, Amadeo, just under $90,000 for all 10 communities. And it took us approximately 6 months to complete. So.
Yeah, it was a bit of the math was the number of communities and the distance in getting there, but there was add-ons to that number or to get to that number. So yeah. Happy to talk offline too about it with Melanie and I.
Great, thank you. Are there any more specific questions for Melanie? There will also be a bigger Q&A section later.
Well, since I'm on a roll, I wouldn't mind asking another question. This is Bernie.
Sure, go for it.
Awesome. So Melanie, there are still so many underserved and unserved communities. So the question I regularly have with those that have implemented systems or in the process of implementing it is, what was that tipping point to get the project going forward? Because there's a lot of talk, but talk is cheap until the action comes. So what was happening such that it came together and you moved forward and you said, okay, we're doing it now, versus a few years ago or in a few years from now?
So I actually shared this story with Sarah and Rob. I started in Duberville 3 years ago when this project started, and they hired me and said, if you don't do anything else, please bring us internet. And it was because our system was at capacity and nobody knew how to fix the problem. And like I said, you can't move to our community and order internet services from Bell. So it's so frustrating. Our community is booming. We have mines, we have, our economy is doing very, very well. But we have almost zero connectivity because of that. So people rely on satellite now. So if you're going to develop resident attraction or labor attraction or youth retention strategy, you have to have the internet. You have to have connectivity and good connectivity. Satellite internet doesn't cut it. And so Duberville was, we were one of 10 communities in the region that had the same problem.
And can I add to that? It really, I'd say, what the tipping point, but then what lit the flame was, in fact, Melanie. I mean, the most critical part of the project was, and still is to this day, is that broadband champion. She is the person that keeps the project in line, keeps the communities talking, keeps the pressure up politically, and keeps it moving. And so she got the tipping point, but once it tipped over, it's been all her. And so I think that goes to keeping the project going after all these years.
Great, thank you. So Melanie, you have a few more slides, correct?
Yes, so Sarah, do you want to jump in where we left off?
Sure, yeah. Just give me one moment.
So this is our NSRBN project timeline. We hand this out in every single piece of correspondence that we send out, every email. It keeps everybody on track, knowing what we're doing. So as you'll see, we have all of our funding applications on there, our CRTC funding application, which is the federal fund that we're planning on, that we applied for. Our ISED Universal Broadband Fund application that we are planning on applying for. It has not come out yet. Our provincial fund that we have applied for. And this fall, you'll see at the red line that the NSRBN, we are in the process of incorporating and formalizing our structure. So we're going through the process with our 8 communities to incorporate it, do a shareholders agreement, and eventually become a regional ISP. So it's very, very exciting. And you'll see our phase 4 implementation, our build scheduled for 2021. So. Our lessons learned is, for any project, we would recommend that you appoint a broadband champion. I happen to be our broadband champion. I live and breathe this project. I dream about it at night. I know everybody in all of our 8 communities. And I've been to all of their communities to speak with their leadership. So that would be my first recommendation. Do your research. Like I said, our handbook, that was the best thing that we had ever done. So it defined our need, it assessed our gap. We did our ground truthing. It had our budget, and it looked at all of the different options. So of how we wanted to structure the NSRBN. We prepared a roadmap. You know, we certainly didn't, it was a flexible roadmap, so we were able to make changes within it. We assembled a team. You know, very early on, it was myself and Amadeo. And our team has continued to grow. We now have an Indigenous and municipal executive team. We have a financial advisor, and we just brought on legal counsel. And just be flexible within your plan. You know, we always have our objective in sight. We're going to build out to all 8 of our communities. You know, how we get there is, it's a jungle gym, not a ladder. So. Considerations, allocations of resources. Some communities, you know, their builds are going to be more expensive than others. It's going to take more time to build out certain specific communities. So it's not, you know, it's not a tit for tat kind of one community gets equal. It's all for one for all kind of approach. Communication is key. And certain communities communicate in different ways. So that's something to really get used to. Engagement. You know, it can't be up to the executive committee or the project manager or the project lead to be engaging each community. Every community is responsible for their own engagement. So the old adage is certainly true. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So we prepared a collaboration agreement right off the top, and we did include it in our resources. And we would recommend that everybody do it. We outlined items such as, you know, who's a member, you can come in, if, you know, on and off ramp clauses, good faith and best efforts, decision-making models, dispute resolutions. We have amended ours from time to time. And then sustainability of community networks. So that's certainly important. As we're developing our business model going forward, The sustainability of our community network is certainly in the forefront of our mind. This isn't, I don't want to present the NSRBN as, the be all or end all of community ISPs, but this is our story. This is how we're kind of going about it. I think our final thought was the time for action is now. Funding is very, very competitive. And I think with the COVID-19, it's just kind of showed how important connectivity is, especially for Indigenous and rural communities. So yeah, that's kind of my story, our story.
Great, thank you so much, Melanie, for that presentation. I see that Hossein, you have a question in the chat. I'm gonna save it for the end if that's okay. Also because I would love to hear if Rob or Penny have something to add to that question also after we present with them. So, fantastic. Rob, are you ready to rock and roll?
Yeah, hi, thanks Anna, and thanks Melanie. That's a fantastic presentation, and it's nice to have Melanie present before me because I'm not on the ground. I'm not somebody involved specifically on planning and rolling out networks. I'm actually an academic, so I'm a researcher at the University of Alberta. And I also am involved in some policy discussions through the First Mile Connectivity Consortium, which is an association of First Nations nonprofit service providers here in Canada. And we have a few members actually on this call, including Penny Carpenter from KNET, who will be speaking on the session. So I'm going to talk about 3 things today, and I'll have to ask everybody, just to bear with me on the first one because I am repeating some material that I did in the other sessions. So sorry if it's repetitive, but I think it's important in this session in particular to talk about nonprofits as a way to deliver and deploy infrastructure in the types of communities we're talking about and regions we're talking about. So I know this session is called the business of a community network, but I just want to expand that definition of business to include nonprofits, social enterprises, cooperatives, and other forms. So first off, why do nonprofit business models make sense in Indigenous and rural and northern contexts? I'll start off by saying there's lots of evidence that small and Indigenous providers are capable of constructing and managing their own networks. Melanie gave us some examples. Of course, we have many others, Penny, Sally, and Western James Bay, many others across the States as well as Canada. But unlike large commercial telecommunication service providers, nonprofit organizations exist to serve the needs of their communities. So after initial capital investment and sometimes ongoing operational supports, which are the same supports that private sector organizations ask to receive in these contexts, nonprofit organizations can reinvest any surplus revenues back into either the enterprise or the community. So these surplus revenues might be used for activities such as deploying or updating infrastructure, rolling out more or updating it, improving the quality of service, lowering prices for users, or applying excess revenues for other social, economic, or cultural products decided on by the community. There isn't that same pressure to remit excess revenues or profits to shareholders. That's just a condition of for-profit companies. So local nonprofit organizations also circulate revenues inside a geographically rural, remote communities, thereby contributing to the development of a sustainable economic base. All the revenues from the sale of services get circulated within that local or regional economy. Furthermore, nonprofit and co-op models can help support cooperation in low-resourced environments. So such approaches can support community initiatives, and rather than engage in competition that encourages organizations to spend time and resources attempting to secure limited funding or limited customers in kind of a zero-sum game, there are numerous it's more about cooperation and collaboration. I thought Melanie gave a fantastic example of that it's not each of these communities that are competing against one another for very limited funding, but rather how did they work together in order to put together that type of, it's a business case, right, in order to serve that region. So I thought that was a fantastic example, Melanie. There are numerous resources available for this type of model. I did in the resources share a blog post from a, excuse me, a Canadian organization called Cooperatives Now. The reason I shared that is their website has a number of resources, including courses, workshops, and advice on business planning, feasibility studies, and even things like incorporation with a focus on co-ops. That's more broad. It's not specific to broadband, but there may be something that some participants may find helpful. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is on the collaboration side. So what benefits do nonprofit business models offer to commercial providers who might want to partner with them? So as I mentioned earlier, and as Melanie mentioned too, principles of competition tend to operate differently in small population and geographically dispersed or rural remote communities. For-profit companies that are required to maximize profit for shareholders are placed in a difficult position in such contexts, which sometimes or often you could say fail to generate adequate return on investment without subsidy. So let's think about this. How can private sector organizations support the development and the efforts of nonprofit service providers? I think Sally Braun, who's on the call from Western James Bay Telecom, puts this really well. She says that we need to move away from the adversarial divide between the for-profit and the not-for-profit service providers. Can you hear me still, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a growing need for a more collaborative approach to providing broadband in these regions. So rather than competing with nonprofits for the same limited public funds, commercial providers could support the efforts of the nonprofits. And this collaborative approach offers many benefits for commercial providers. So for example, it reduces costs by training and employing local residents. We all know how much it costs to fly between these communities. Somebody in an earlier session said it's, you know, compared to flying to Paris or something, it's so much more expensive to go to the Canadian North, right? So it's very expensive, so it can save costs by building that capacity for local technicians and maintenance and administration locally. It contributes to the local and regional economics, which in turn creates additional demand for services, right? So funds that circulate locally could then be used to pay for the services themselves. It can improve infrastructure through partnerships to increase redundancy and path diversity. And it's also a good demonstration of corporate social responsibility because it provides tangible benefits to communities. I did want to share my screen for a moment. One of the resources that we shared was from the Alberta Broadband Toolkit. Can everybody see my screen? There's an image there. Okay,
Yep.
great. So this is on page 28 of that. So this is in the Canadian province of Alberta. This is just for illustrative purposes. I'd be really interested in hearing people's feedback. But the idea is to take a look at some of the range of business models that we had identified with partners here in Alberta. So you can see here there's 3 levels. It actually probably should be inverted because infrastructure, of course, is in the ground. I guess it could also be fixed wireless, but you have that infrastructure level of triangles. You've got the network operations level, which is the circles, and then the internet service provision. And so if you look at the different sort of colors there, those are representing either private or commercial providers or public or nonprofit providers. And what we've identified here is certain communities will go with certain types of models while others will go with blended models. So for example, Tabor in Alberta went for a fully private type of model where all 3 elements are owned by a commercial provider. And then at the other sort of side of the spectrum on the right there, the town of Olds had gone for a fully kind of cooperative or locally owned model. But then what I really want to point out here is some of the different variations. So you can see there, like the city of Calgary actually owned its infrastructure and did some of the network operations, so the network management, but then they allow internet service providers to actually offer retail internet. Similar thing with Parkland County, where they actually own some towers, I believe, but then they lease those out to different providers that did the actual, so they own the asset, the physical asset, and then they lease that out to others who might operate the network or provide internet service. The reason why I'm showing this is you may have growing capacity in a community, but you may not have anybody who's fully trained in order to operate a network or provide internet yet. But if the community owns that physical asset and maybe partners with another service provider, that could happen at a certain point, and then over time, as local capacity gets built, you may want to transfer over more of those functions to people located in the local community. The other thing is I will note the risk here. So you can see here, this is the risk to the local organization or sort of the local government. You'll have greater risk if you take on more, of course, less risk with less. So this is just trying to demonstrate that too as just a point of conversation. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing this. I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. So the last thing I'll talk about is what are some of the structural barriers that nonprofits face when they're working to set up and operate networks? And this is kind of aimed at policymakers, funders, and regulators who need to recognize that there's important distinctions between private sector commercial providers and non-for-profit or indigenous or local government providers. These are in a few areas. So the first one I'll speak to is funding challenges. And I was actually pretty happy to hear from Melanie about some of the things you pointed out with some of the resources you were able to access for your funds. And one big one was that you were able to get funding to help develop your proposal. And I think that's a great step forward, because oftentimes smaller organizations don't have that in-house expertise. So it's great to know that there was support there to work with a project manager and somebody who could help put together that proposal. Another thing is just challenges with credit. So actually Sally is the expert on this. She had raised this with respect to First Nations in Canada, that certain funds might require applicants to provide a letter of credit from a lending institution. But here in Canada, this is a barrier for some Indigenous groups because they can face challenges in securing credit, which is due to factors totally outside of their control. So for example, on reserve, you can't mortgage property, right? So that becomes like a challenge in securing that credit. So instead, funding applicants might provide things like examples of past success in developing and operating other kinds of infrastructure. So for example, electrification projects, water and wastewater, roads, airports, that kind of thing. It's infrastructure just like broadband. Why can't that be used as evidence of a success in developing and delivering infrastructure? The other thing is upfront costs. Oftentimes the way these grants work is that you kind of do the work and then you apply to get the funding after the fact to be reimbursed. But if you're a small organization with not a lot of cash flow, that can be a barrier. So in order to respond to that, there should be an opportunity to get upfront costs. And then the other thing is in-kind contributions. So a lot of funding programs in Canada require cash support from the applicants. But in the case of a nonprofit or a community or an Indigenous project, what about being able to count in-kind support? I know some grant programs do that, but I think that's an important indicator of support from the community and nation. I'll also talk about deployment challenges. Internet Society is doing a great job in terms of highlighting access to mobile spectrum. In the States, I know there was that spectrum that was provided to tribal nations. We don't have that in Canada yet. It would be great to see. Another piece is about wholesale open access to transport. As a condition of funding, providers or applicants to grants like the CRTC fund have to provide open access to their infrastructure. But what does that actually mean? Okay. I'm going to have raise a couple of points here I've heard from FMCC members. that point to some of the limitations of open access in the wholesale area. So one might be, you know, what tiers of wholesale service are offered? Does a wholesale provider actually offer 1 gigabyte, 10 gigabyte, and so on? Or do they only offer like lower tiers of open access? Should it be open to different tiers of access? I know that Melanie had spoken about dark fiber. That's amazing to see that ground truthing that was done and finding out that there was existing dark fiber that could be used. In Canada, we don't have any kind of public database or anything that lets us see what fiber is available. I thought that was a great exercise and example, and can we see that in more projects and more communities to make sure that we're using the infrastructure and assets that are already in place. And the other thing is just planning ahead, right? So recipients of these funds should be required to install enough transport capacity and path diversity to meet projected demand and network redundancy for at least 10 years. If it's going in the ground as fiber, that should be the minimum, that it's good for 10 years projected capacity. I'll mention two more things because I want to make sure we have time for discussion and questions. One is a big thing happening in Canada now is access to support structures. So these are things like, you know, like the hydro poles where you might hang fiber optic cables. There's a lot of push for fiber to the home projects. But what we're hearing is in many communities, it's very difficult and expensive to access these poles. So that's become a big discussion at the CRTC. How do you make sure that people can actually access the structures that support their deployment? So that needs to be an area of focus by regulators. And then the last thing I'll mention is community consultation. So great to see that in Melanie's presentation as well, like that push for you know, community involvement and a local broadband champion doing a lot of that work. Applicants should show that they have consulted and provided clear information about proposed broadband projects, so fair consultation. So this should include meaningful consultation and informed consent in the case of Indigenous communities. One thing to note is that a market study is not adequate evidence of consultation because it can be done using publicly available information without any interaction with the community. So if you're approached by a group that's looking to connect your community, are they actually coming and meeting and discussing their project with the people living there? And it's really important to have clear information. So applicants should provide clear and plain language definitions and explanation of the division of roles and responsibilities of project applications. So this should include detail on ownership. Remember I showed that example. There are different forms of ownership and partnership available, as well as operations and requirements for meaningful consent. And it should include information about open access. So that might be a question to ask is it open access and what are those conditions in this particular project? So yeah, I'll stop there just to make sure we have time for questions and discussion. So thanks everyone for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Rob. That was really great. So I'm going to move to our Q&A with Penny, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of our panelists. So yeah, let's kick it off. So Penny sent me a video also to show you all, but Penny, I wanted to ask you first if you could give us an introduction to yourself and your work and your background and other work that you've done.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Penny Carpenter, and I'm the Director of KNET Services, located here in Northwestern Ontario, in the town of Sulacote. I'm not sure if many of you know Sulacote, but it's a small Northwestern town, about 5,000 people. Sulacote is the hub of the north of the remote First Nations. So our job for the last 20 years has been to provide a broadband connection to all the remote communities in the north. And then some of the communities in the northeast and Treaty 3 area, we do provide a connection to the school or the health center, depending on a project that we're doing. But today we'll just focus on the community, since it's a talk about community networks, we can focus on the north and the community networks that have been connected. So it has been like, I can't believe it's 20 years. I'm not really that old. But in 2000, we started with a very small project providing T1 connections to the KO communities. And then that quickly expanded to all the other communities. And then there was a group of 13 communities that were hard to reach. So then we worked on CBAD satellite connection. So that was communities like as far north as Pewanik and Fort Severn. And then in like the Webequay, Niskanaga area, sort of a Matawa, central, remote north. So I think, yeah, so we have a video we're going to share. In March, in January, we had an IT technician meeting for our research project. And so I brought together a couple technicians and then I asked them to be involved in a video. So that's what we're going to show right now.
In 2009, the community said, we are using a lot of broadband and Bell's network was just not sufficient to provide it. And that's because it was designed for just telephone.
We had one phone dial-up in the community to the plan office. Then we were able to upgrade to 8 dial-up phones for the community.
It was at the point where Bell was looking for spare parts on eBay. Man and Bell Alliance got together and they designed a project.
Winter. I'm from Kingfisher Lake and I work as a community technician. Patients are being thrown in just for simple, like say, dental pre-op that could ship a patient out. Whereas nowadays with high-speed internet, you have telehealth. Basically, just take your child into a nursing station and voila, he goes to the TV. And then pre-op is done right there.
My name is Terry Morrow and I'm from Laxo First Nation, Ontario. I'm the IT director for Laxo First Nation. We've been able to have more Chromebooks and iPads in the schools for teaching purposes. It also opened up a lot of programs for video streaming for kids with disabilities.
Hi, my name is Chris Glidey. I'm from Victoria Lake, Ontario. And I am a technician for KI Telecom.
We got about 218 cable subscribers and about 600 to 700 modems in the community.
Okay, so that means you've got about 2 to 3 modems per household?
Per household, yeah.
Wow.
The online gamers and streamers, people that use Netflix and just recently Disney Plus came online. It just shot way up.
My name is Archie Wabas. I'm from One Lake First Nation. I am the Economic Development Officer. If they don't see any improvements to our system, they probably will want to have other service provider to come in and look into providing these services in our community.
My name is Kennedy Fiddler. I'm from Sandy Lake and I am a Sandy Lake First Nation broadband coordinator. Look at down south, like I said, they're starting to wire up each home's fiber optics. And when you compare it to us, we're back into the dial-up days. My name is Lefty Kamno. I'm from Berskin and I work as an economic development officer. We want more bandwidth, and we will maxed out for a couple of years already. So
our community and the surrounding communities, I hear the same thing. Internet is bandwidth is maxed out, and really nothing we can do with it. We'll have to come up with ways to maintain or manage our bandwidth in the community for now.
Before, internet was just kind of a niche thing. Some people had it, some people didn't, but now we're in 2020 and everybody needs it. It's a need, not a want anymore. So.
So KNET, what KNET is we're more of a network aggregator. So we provide the bandwidth to the communities. We bring transport from Toronto. All our circuits go to the telco hub in Toronto at 151 Front, where we interconnect with OTN and Justice to provide additional services on the network. And then we buy bulk internet for the different circuits that go to the First Nations. But from all those technicians, like they have been running their local, so we bring the pipe into the community, and then at the local level, they run either a cable plant that connects homes and buildings, or in 2 communities, they have wireless plants where they connect all the buildings through wireless equipment on towers. So we work with each community very closely, supporting them in their cable plant development, like when they need to upgrade, like this is through the last 20 years. Like our motto was always to support local community development, making sure those jobs stay in the community, running training programs, IT training programs, and now there's a need for more IT positions in schools and health centers as that infrastructure gets developed. Like the one gentleman mentioned, Chromebooks in schools. Like all the First Nation schools in the north are probably across Canada or Ontario. They want to be at par with the provincial education system. So as they rolled out Chromebooks, so did our schools. And so you need a lot more bandwidth at the schools. In the health centers, that we've been doing telemedicine in health centers for 20 years. But there's other IT, there's digital x-rays, there's electronic medical records that doctors are using or the community is starting to use. So we really have to make sure that there's enough bandwidth at the health center. So when they talk about lack of capacity, when we started 20 years ago, we were just building on the Bell infrastructure, and it was just T1 technology. But by 2010, there was really a gap in capacity. They really demanded more capacity to run these tools that were needed in the community. So then we did start a NAN fiber build, and then NAN, which is our political tutorial organization, they were responsible for the fiber build, which was completed in 2016. So then each community had fiber to their head end. So they were able to buy a bigger pipe. So they went from the T1 to 100 meg circuit. And then over the last couple of years, they've gone to a 1 gig circuit, but really using maybe 200 megs or 500 megs. So when they say that there's a bottleneck now, so what has happened now is Bell on that whole fiber leg in Bell's own infrastructure, Bell has run out of capacity. So for us to get more capacity, we're dependent on Bell upgrading their own infrastructure, which they don't have a capital plan to, because Bell says they don't really make money serving rural and remote north. So we have worked on a proposal and submitted it to the federal and provincial funding bodies. So we are waiting for capacity. So those, so these local technicians that are running their own ISP, so they do run it like a business and have done it since the very beginning, where they're building homes and schools and health centers, generating the revenue so they can have IT positions in the community that can go do the cable drops at the homes or repair the wiring on towers or support if someone's having a computer problem. So, you know, that like they have been very successful in running that model in the community. Like, I guess what I forgot to talk, like before 2000, like Bell really did not have any interest in the North. They knew that there wasn't really a business model. So they weren't going to invest and develop internet in the communities. So that is why we went ahead and did it.
Great. Thank you, Penny, for that background. I have a few questions for you. The first is, what would you say are the basic needs for starting a community network business?
Well, capacity, like Melanie talked about, you really need to know what the infrastructure is coming to the community. And if there's none, you know, what is it? Like, is it fiber that you're gonna build? Like, is there towers that are along a road that you can build fiber to? Or can you plan to put it through the bush or something, or the trend that the community is located at? And I guess at the same time, like you can't just bring a pipe into a community. If you're going to go with like this community ISP model, you have to plan on training local people to run it. Like you can't just plop it in and then it's not going to be successful. Otherwise, it's always going to be a third party that's running it, like some contracting someone that lives somewhere else to come in and maintain the system.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier that Bell doesn't see the air quotes business case for updating the infrastructure. And that's a common thread that we see in the US and Canada. A lot of these big telecom companies say there is no business case for us to go out there. Like the return on investment is just not good enough for our company. And you know, considering they are all huge telecoms and we know how much their CEOs make and they have plenty of money to spare, that's really hard to believe. So how do we combat this narrative that these companies make, and how do we make a business case?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be with, like, I know, like I do go back to Bell and with my my wholesale connection and his director and complain whatever, but sometimes because we work with First Nations, it's really then my role to educate the struggles with the First Nations I work with. So then there's a different voice, like maybe more of a political voice. But at the same time, I think about how like CRTC has set the 50-10 rate, and really like, so if they're saying all Canadians, you know, that is the rate. And but like it's not gonna, in our area, it's not gonna happen by our, you know, our private telcos. You know, it's gonna happen through the models, like the model that we're doing, the model Melanie, like a private, I mean, a model that fits that area. So maybe, like, I think the government will have to start thinking differently about how these communities are going to achieve that rate and not really depend so much more on private business.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a policy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've done a lot of thinking and throwing ideas out here at KNED and with First Mile and different partners. You know, how do we change? Like, because like in the last 20 years, the building of broadband has been this apply for funding as broadband dollars come available, as these programs come available, and hope for the best. It's not really a practical based on, oh yes, this community, they're not at 50-10. You know, here's a plan that can make it happen. Like it's not planned like infrastructure's planned. Well, I guess that's maybe a change that might, you know, maybe we can just, it's not gonna probably happen overnight, but maybe in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe that will happen. Mm-hmm. Like First Nations are funded in our area through, well, it used to be Indian Affairs, but ISC now. And like, they really, even though they do have broadband on their list for capital, it's really not something that a pot of money is there to build broadband in a community like fiber to the home. So I mean, like until it's really seen as part of the infrastructure in a community, then it's not ever going to be fully funded.
Mm-hmm. I have one other question for you, and then I saw that Sally had raised her hand, so I'm going to ask my question real quick and then come to you, Sally. But my other question for you was, what are some common mistakes that you see first-time, community broadband champions or community networks managers or business owners make? And do you think are the best ways of avoiding these, or even common mistakes that you have made in your network, and how would you go back and what would you tell yourself if you could go back?
That's a difficult one. Yeah, I guess really knowing everything. So I can talk about a current project. So we have a current project that our operations manager applied for in 2017. So planned it with a local community and used those numbers, and then, but maybe like it wasn't a full scope of the future needs of the community. So now that we're in the trying to implement it, the community's like, well, we have this future area that we're going to build houses in now. We need to reach that area. So it really just changes the whole scope of the project. So I guess, yeah, really planning for the future, not just for your present needs is important.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, and then training local staff, like, yeah, we get the connections into sites, but it really needs to be maintained. And like network security is a big one nowadays. There's lots of hackers out there. So you have to make sure that your buildings have firewalls and your network's protected. So just all that planning needs to happen. So you really need someone locally that's trained and understands and is doing the work.
Mm-hmm. And Sally, I saw you had a raised hand. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I just wanted to add that one of the problems one of the issues that I see happening over and over again is the disconnect between what the political leadership understands is the problem and what the actual problem is. And the actual problem is that smaller ISPs like ourselves do not have the funds for operations because the cost of bandwidth is so high. That is a huge problem right now. The other problem is getting the politicians to speak to the large telcos and explain to the telcos that this is a problem that is crippling our economy and the price of bandwidth needs to come down.
Yeah, like I can speak like the price of bandwidth, like now that we're getting into the larger circuits, like the future price of like communities to get 10 to the home, we'll need 10 gig circuits, and the cost of a 10 gig circuit is in the tens of thousands of dollars, and you can't really expect a community like the charge to a home will just be outrageous and unaffordable. So I mean that cost of bandwidth, like the larger telco is saying that's the cost of bringing it to the community. I mean, that's how they justify it. So that's a real challenge. So this is, the sustainability of the network. And then even on the ongoing cost of equipment that you use. Nowadays, lots of your equipment, you have to buy an annual service contract, which is usually about 10 to 15% of your purchase price. So like building that into the budget. So yeah, networks, no longer, they're really expensive and a lot of planning. So really, having skilled people to be able to manage that is important.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sally. Eddie IL put a question in the chat. Do you want to unmute and ask it, or I can read it out? All right, I'll go ahead and read it out. All right, it says, since incumbent ISPs are the ones that typically have the resources to get the funding to extend broadband infrastructure, what rules are in place to ensure that those ISPs actually collaborate with First Nation governments to ensure the funding they get actually extends to infrastructure to First Nations? Are there any rules in place requiring them to collaborate with First Nations in order to get funding?
I would say, like, there's no real rules unless they're building it on behalf of the First Nation, and then they have to get, you know, work with the chief and council and get a resolution.
Okay. Yeah, Rob.
I think there are some like larger telcos that did have the former Industry Canada CTI funding, and and then some First Nations weren't really aware that they're getting fiber to their community. But, but in my case, if I'm applying on behalf of a group of First Nations, then I do have to make sure that I have band council resolutions and engagement with the communities.
I was just going to note too, with the CRTC broadband fund, they do say that the applicants have to demonstrate that they've consulted with communities, but what that actually means is not as clear. So there's a lot of discussion and debate around that. But I think what Penny is saying about a band council resolution or that kind of substantive support really demonstrates that the applicant has gone to the community or to a group like Penny's to talk to them about what this project will be and what it will entail. Yeah, so it kind of depends on some of the funds, but I know the CRTC fund has some requirements for that.
Great, thank you, Rob. I think seeing as we have about 15 minutes left, now's a good time to open up Q&A for all the speakers. There's one question from Hossein that I kicked back to ask now, so I'll start off the Q&A with this question. Hossein asks, what is your experience in writing applications for funding? Are there any specific challenges? And I think that was directed at you, Melanie, during your presentation, but I also want to open that up to you two, Penny and Rob.
So I'm sorry, I'll just reiterate the question to make sure I have it. What's my experience in writing applications?
Yeah, or what's your experience like in applying for funding? Any specific challenges that you have faced?
So the NSRBN has been successful, knock on wood, in applying for funding so far. I did include a fairly extensive list of all the different funding applications we had applied for. Just to kind of piggyback on Penny's comment about the CTI funding. Dubreuilville was successful for a CTI funding, or Bell was successful for a CTI funding application on behalf of Dubreuilville that we didn't know about until it was approved. So that was kind of a happy approval, but we did not write that application. But we have been very, very aggressive. Any pointers? You know, don't miss anything. Check, cross every T and dot every I. Collaboration. Well, not all funding specifically says, you know, to consult or makes it mandatory to consult with First Nations. It's very, very competitive right now. Every single funding program is oversubscribed, you know, if not double, triple. So you have to bring your A game. And if you're not going to, don't even bother putting in the time. So make sure that you do it right the first time. So obviously we have, you know, a great deal of collaboration with our First Nations partners, the municipalities, and our official French language community. So, and another thing that we did was we put a lot of time into getting support letters from all of our industry partners in all of our 10 communities. So, you know, whether it was a gold mine, sawmill, the school boards, the hospitals, we went out, knocked on doors, shook hands, because your connectivity affects all of those. And the letters of support really do matter. So.
Yeah, I don't think I can add much more. Yeah, it's just making sure you have the right information. And really, we did apply like for quite a few sites under CTI that didn't get approved, and you know sometimes it's the government of the day too, and yeah, they're very oversubscribed. The broadband funding, like there's a big need for broadband funding in Canada.
Great, thank you. There's another question from Joel in the chat about whether remote rural broadband systems are still an option in Canada. I believe that popped up during your presentation, Rob. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, hi, and I did see Emilio mention Dr. Greg Taylor's work. So I'd say Dr. Taylor has done some great work on that. He's probably more familiar, well, I know he is more familiar than I on the current status of that. But one thing I was going to say about that is, because there was a follow-up question that talked about, you know, fixed wireless as kind of like a stopgap at the middle mile while we wait for fiber optic transport networks. And I'm just going to turn that back to the local infrastructure. And we have had lots of cases where people have wired up local communities with fiber, even when the transport hasn't necessarily been fiber yet. And then when it came time to switch over, they already had that local capacity and network in place. So I'm thinking about some of the satellite communities that Penny works with, and I think Sally too has a few satellite communities that have that local infrastructure wired in place, sorry. And then as well, like Nunavik, the Inuit government there in northern Quebec, had satellite infrastructure. They had fiber to the home in a few communities, and now they're planning an undersea fiber optic cable. So of course, the middle mile of the transport is really important, but it's also, you know, there are other models that focus on that local infrastructure too, even before it's there.
Thank you, Rob. Are there any other questions?
Actually, if I can just add to what Rob was saying. Rob, nice to see you. Hope you're feeling better. And there's a really good pilot project going on right now, and Rob just reminded me of it. So CENGEN, what is it, the Center of Excellence for Next Generation Networks out of Ottawa, are doing something near, we'll call it central Southern Ontario, around Muskoka area, where they are trialing a middle mile high capacity microwave link into a community, and then in that community they are deploying fiber. And so exactly, Rob, what you were talking about, and I believe it's called West Perry Sound, a CENGEN project. So you can check online for that. We'll wait to see how that goes. And I know some other communities are trialing in CENGEN white space, trying to also do that. It's not licensed openly in Canada yet, but it's something else that we're looking at so that we can fiber a community where it's challenged with a long haul or a middle mile, you know, lack of capacity.
Great, thank you for that. Are there any other questions, or if any of the other people on the call have any specific experiences with this topic and, you know, community networks as a business that you'd like to share, now is a fantastic time. Sally, I see you have a raised hand.
Yes, I think that it's really important to always be prepared for the next batch of funding that's going to come out. And because I do believe with what Penny's talked about and what Melanie is talking about, there's an enormous demand for internet, and it's not going to go away. So what people can do now is just have all their papers in order, all their documents in order, line up funding, talk to banks, get your financial house in as good an order as you can, and so that way when the funding drops or is announced, you're ready to go.
Thank you, Sally. That's a really important point. All right, I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one.
I'll just build on what Sally said, like the internet, like it's not gonna go like it's just part of our everyday life now. And like I work with a lot of remote communities, and they do travel out. Well, maybe not right now, but I mean, they do just want what mainstream has, and more so like telemedicine is big in our communities, mental health is big, so it's all done through video, diabetes, all these health services are very important to the community. Education, like in the north, we do run an internet high school. Well, at first it was, this year it's expanded to 18 sites now because of COVID. You know, like with COVID, we have more kids staying home because there's, you know, they can't go out to be billeted to other homes when they come out for high school. Like, so in our region, I guess I should say that, in our region, once you hit grade 8, you have to travel out of your community to go to high school. So there's only 2 remote communities that have high schools. So yeah, well, as soon as you have to go to grade 9, you're either coming to Silicote, Dryden, or Thunder Bay, and then you get billeted out or there's a residence you stay in. So some of the residents aren't set up for the kids, or the kids, if they come out, then they can't go home. Otherwise they have to isolate for 2 weeks. Like usually they go home for traditional week and Christmas and Thanksgiving, but they can't do that. So, I mean, it's more so important now to have a great connection so students can continue to do their learning. And then just all the other community, like everyone does online banking, Service Canada is all online. Yeah, it's just the way of our life is now. So the 50-10 rate, it was great, but we just need to figure out how we're going to achieve that in all of our communities and sustain it.
Absolutely. All right, I'll do a last call for questions right now. All right, hearing nothing, I'm happy to end 3 minutes early for today. Thank you all to Penny and Melanie and Rob for joining us today. Your insight and your experiences and your knowledge is just invaluable, especially, you know, trying to navigate the business of community network is just, it's so hard. You know, there's just so many technical things to keep in mind, and it's really helpful to hear from people who study it really closely and do the work on the ground as well. So thank you all, and thank you all for joining today. We're really excited to see you next week at our next session. And if you haven't registered for the ICS, definitely do it. We'll continue having these conversations, and yeah, have a good weekend and a good rest of your week.
Bye, everyone.